The President of the United States recently shared this photoshopped image on social media, showing NATO leaders a map where the US has taken control of not only Venezuela, but more shockingly, territory from loyal NATO allies that helped the US fight several wars in the past decades, specifically Denmark and Canada. To many, this seems like something only a madman would do. But according to a viral speech by Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, this is all part of a bigger trend. This is a return to
an era of great power rivalry. That the rules-based order is fading. That the strong can do what they can and the weak must suffer what they must.
And while Carney has a completely different vision on how to behave in such a new world order, the overall idea that we are moving back to an era of great power competition is actually in line with what one of the architects of Trump's foreign policy, Stephen Miller, recently told CNN's Jake Tapper.
But we live in a world, in the real world, Jake, that is governed by strength, that is governed by force, that is governed by power.
Therefore, it makes sense that Trump's new national security strategy literally says they are returning to the so-called Monroe Doctrine, under which the US has historically sought to keep other great powers out of the Western Hemisphere. This means that according to Miller, the US will now be
using its military to secure our interests unapologetically in our hemisphere.
And that's exactly what we've seen in the last few weeks, isn't it? Therefore, some like Dr. Wes Mitchell have said that Trump's actions are, in fact, rooted in a clear and compelling logic, grounded in the discipline of grand strategy. So, what is this logic? Well, one word: consolidation. Venezuela, Greenland, Canada, the US is acting like a great power that is consolidating its power in its own hemisphere to recover its strength first, which will allow it to ultimately compete with other great powers like Russia and China in a new era of great power competition. However, according to the authors of a recent viral international relations paper, Professor Stacy Goddard and Abraham Newman, this explanation does not make much sense, because actually, upon closer inspection, Russia's and China's activities in Venezuela and around Greenland are extremely limited. On top of that, their resources are way too expensive to truly benefit the US. Therefore, they argue that to truly understand Trump's attacks on neighbors and allies, we need to view the new international order through the lens of what came before the era of great power competition, the era of competing royal houses that cared about personal wealth and personal status. To see how that works, Goddard and Newman.
I think Stacey and I always give the example of Game of Thrones. It's like almost everybody on Earth relates to this show about a small group of elites who really don't care about their societies in general. They just care about redistributing resources amongst these houses. And that is a system that for most of human history dominated international relations.
So could it be that if we view Trump as a neo-royalist and the refinery and mineral mining owning billionaires around him as his court, Venezuela, Greenland and also, strangely, high tariffs against China's biggest rival, India, it will all fall into place? So who is right? Is the new world order we are seeing right now a Trump versus Carney style return to great power politics, or rather the return of the corrupt politics of royal dynasties? To find out, I did on the one hand a massive deep dive into the fundamentals and the history of great power politics and how it compares to Trump's new national security strategy versus Carney's speech. And on the other hand, an in-depth interview with professors Goddard and Newman. But before we get into which story can explain the new world order best, we need to understand what we are leaving behind. That is, the rise and fall of the rules-based liberal international order. Newfoundland, Canada, 1941. Churchill, arguably still the leader of the most powerful empire the world has ever seen, meets his counterpart from the richest nation on earth, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Together, they sit down to discuss what they see as the ideal international order, an order that would never again produce another devastating world war. And here they've just agreed on the first pillar of the rules-based international order, which means that nations have borders that should be kept as they are. They have a right to self-govern. They have a right to trade freely, and they can decide with whom they trade. And finally, the seas should be kept open to facilitate this international trade. Now, the second pillar of the liberal, rules-based international order was economic. And for that, we have to go back to Bretton Woods, the United States, 1944. 44 nations come together to put an end to economic chaos, the economic chaos of the 1930s and 40s. This conference sets the stage for the following international institutions that will create order, where before there was chaos. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, that would later turn into the World Trade Organization. This meant that tariffs should be the same for everyone. Then there's the World Bank. All poor countries should get loans to develop, independent of their political allegiance to certain great powers. Then there's the IMF. Getting loans to save your currency from collapsing will now depend on your economic program, rather than your political allegiance to certain great powers. Finally, the third pillar of the rules-based order was the UN, a community of states, both strong and weak, that all pledged to follow even more rules. 1944, Dumbarton Oaks, the United States. 1945, Yalta, the Soviet Union. And finally, 1945, San Francisco, the United States. These conferences led to the creation of the United Nations. Countries that signed the UN Charter agreed that they would respect: number 1, human rights. Number 2, international law. Number 3, they signed that armed force shall not be used save in the common interest. And then finally, that the goal of this new international order was to promote the economic and social advancement of all people. Very lofty goals. And just as with Bretton Woods, this led to the creation of some international institutions which theoretically made it more difficult for states to act on their own in key areas like war, which was only allowed if the UN authorized it, and justice. States were held accountable by the International Court of Justice. On top of that, some states went even further by signing up to the International Criminal Court, which could and did sue leaders from weaker states like Sudan and the Congo. But crucially, as Carney admitted,
we knew the story of the international rules-based order was partially false. That the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient. That trade rules were enforced asymmetrically. And we knew that international law applied with varying rigor depending on the identity of the accused or the victim.
For example, the International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants against Putin and Netanyahu, but they are practically untouchable. The IMF was far stricter, enforcing painful economic reforms on small powers like Egypt, Greece and Argentina, than against strong countries like the UK. Also, the UN sanctioned small powers like Zimbabwe and North Korea for human rights abuses, but never strong countries like China, the Soviet Union, and the US for similar offenses. And despite countries signing up not to invade one another except for self-defense, both Western and Eastern powers invaded several countries during this so-called liberal rules-based order. Still, we cannot be 100% sure that this was because of the rules-based order and international institutions. And in hindsight, I think we can say that the liberal international order looked like a big success. There were no new world wars, and even without taking those into account, the years from 45 to 2011 had relatively fewer conflicts between states than the decades before them. We can also see that in the liberal order, relations between countries on average got much friendlier. We even saw several countries joining a security community, NATO, and on the flip side we saw far less countries being in severe or lesser rivalry like France, Germany and the UK, which used to always be at each other's throats. Finally, on the economic side, after a massive reduction in global tariffs, we saw an explosion in global trade and, more importantly, we saw a massive reduction in global poverty. And yet, while free trade under the rules-based international order arguably helped drag millions out of poverty, especially in Asia, the bottom 50% of Americans saw their share of income drop remarkably in the second half of the liberal rules-based order. So it is perhaps no wonder that Americans elected a candidate twice that talked openly about blowing up this liberal order. But we have to be honest, it was not just Trump that started this process. The three great powers actually seem to have been in on it together. First, in 2014, member of the UN Permanent Security Council Russia annex Crimea, and then in 2022 several other provinces from Ukraine. Next, when it comes to the economic pillar, Trump's 2018 tariff barrage already completely undermined the principle of low tariffs that should be equal against all nations. Meanwhile, China actively undermined the IMF and World Bank when it became one of the biggest lenders to poor and crisis-stricken countries. Finally, both China and Russia already had a terrible human rights record, and honestly, the US lost a lot of credibility in 2003 under Bush and Cheney when they essentially authorized the use of torture in CIA black sites and in Guantanamo Bay. Still, Trump now almost announcing new tariffs against a new nation every month and threatening to annex territories from its most loyal allies, that genuinely looks like the final nail in the coffin of the rules-based international order. So, no wonder that Carney said that
we are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition.
The liberal rules-based international order is dead. About that, almost everyone agrees. The real question is, what's next? Are we heading back to an era of great power competition like Carney and the Trump administration seem to believe? Or should we think back further? Are Trump's chaotic actions better understood through the lens of the emergence of new kings and courts of billionaire backers such as the Trump dynasty, the House of Putin, and the House of Modi? Chapter 2. What will the new global order actually look like? The first view is that we are now heading back to a new era of great power competition, where great power leaders like Trump and Putin have a very different vision than middle power leaders like Carney. This means that the world will look a lot more like it did in the 18th, 19th and early 20th centuries. International relations scholars tend to refer to this order as the Westphalian global order, after the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which greatly reduced the power of royal houses in favor of nation-states and their bureaucracies. In this new Westphalian order, you may say, international institutions like the UN, IMF and World Trade Organization lose what's left of their waning power. Instead, the world will once again be completely determined by the actions of great powers like the US, China, Russia, and perhaps India and Europe. According to international relations professor John Mersheimer, who famously belongs to the school of thought known as realism, in such a world order,
that states can never be certain that they won't end up living next door to a really powerful state that has malign intentions. All of that causes states to do everything they can to be as powerful as possible.
And depending on how powerful they end up being, states are then classified as great powers, middle powers, or small powers. And they will all play a different variation of the power game. First, small powers will either try to survive by claiming neutrality, like Sweden and Belgium did in the Second World War, or by aligning themselves with a great power for protection, like Finland and Hungary did. Meanwhile, middle powers will either try to play great powers off against one another, like India has historically done, or they will do the same that Carney suggested in his speech, which is
value-based realism.
Meaning that liberal countries like Canada and Finland, for example, for every geopolitical situation, they will weigh their liberal values, such as the importance of human rights, respecting boundaries, and democracy, and they will weigh that with geopolitical reality. Especially for Canada, this is a break with the past. Concretely, whereas Canada's previous Prime Minister Justin Trudeau frequently challenged great powers like China on their human rights records, Carney is subtly indicating that Canada may no longer do this if the geopolitical reality is that this would get Canada into trouble with a great power. Simultaneously, Carney indicates that the way forward may be for liberal value-based middle powers to form coalitions with countries with similar values that may help them stand up to great powers with different values, such as Trump's America. You see, while the Trump team also writes in their national security strategy that they believe in realism now, they give a version of it a different name. Flexible realism, which so far seems to mean might is right. A strong country like the US can take Greenland from Denmark because
Denmark is a tiny country with a tiny economy and a tiny military. They cannot defend Greenland.
And this is what international scholars mean when they say might is right. The US should get Greenland because it is strong enough to defend Greenland from other great powers, and Denmark is not. But why does a great power like the US need to do this in the first place? Aren't they already powerful enough? No, say scholars like Mersheimer. Without international commitments to respect borders, even great powers like the US, Russia or China will always fear that another great power will become much stronger than them, upsetting the balance of power. Therefore, they may even want to
dominate your region of the world is because in that situation, there is no other state that is capable of hurting you.
And this logic leads to so-called spheres of influence, where great powers try to deny other great powers the ability to threaten them by keeping them as far away as possible. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the US tried to keep other great powers out of the Americas under the so-called Monroe Doctrine. And using similar logic, Hitler at some point actually proposed a sphere of influence in Europe, which he called the German Monroe Doctrine. And people like Professor Mersheimer have used this logic of the Monroe Doctrine to make the case that the West provoked Russia into invading Ukraine by meddling in its sphere of influence. The Trump team has written in their national security strategy that they are essentially returning to the Monroe Doctrine. Some call it the Donroe Doctrine now. And some, like Dr. Wes Mitchell, have used this type of logic to argue that Trump's strategic actions are in fact rooted in a clear and compelling logic, firmly grounded in the discipline of grand strategy. He says that Russia and China are the US natural great power competitors, but that the US no longer has the strength to fight them all over the world. And therefore the US is now essentially retreating to its own Western hemisphere, just as it has done historically many times before. Venezuela and Greenland are both about securing access to vital resources and crucially about denying them to competitors. So what we've seen so far is simply a return to great power competition. Everything the US has done so far is just in the national interest. Flexible realism is a cynical but not illogical take on America first. However, to me, there were at least 3 details about recent events that I could not explain with this theory. First, capturing Maduro does not seem to have been in a US national interest, given that the oil there is too expensive to get out of the ground and China did not get that much anyway. Second, annexing Greenland and in the process completely alienating European allies does not make much sense either, given that the US already had almost unlimited military access to the island and easy economic access to its minerals. Finally, if Trump was truly following a great power style strategy, why did he recently tariff the hell out of India, which is China's natural rival in Asia? This is where Goddard and Newman's neo-royalist theory starts making a lot more sense. They claim that what we are seeing today is,
rather than a system of territorial nation states, rather than a system of rule-governed institutions, what we see is a system of international politics that's structured around the interest of ruling cliques, which include a personalist absolute sovereign, and basically his network of whether or not his family, whether or not its financial interests, ideologues that legitimate his rule.
They call this neo-royalism because rather than a return to great power politics of the Westphalian order, it would potentially be more like a return to the world order before the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. You see, the Peace of Westphalia came about to put an end to various devastating wars that plagued the Holy Roman Empire. Wars that often came about because of royal succession, not the national interest. For example, the Dutch War of Independence against Spain arguably came about after the Dutch suddenly found themselves with a new Spanish king that had essentially inherited the Netherlands through a series of marriages. So in the royalist system, the main actors were not states, but rather ruling monarchs and their cliques. Therefore, most wars in those days were not about the national interest at all. They were about increasing royal wealth and status. Similarly, Goddard and Newman argue that in the case of Maduro's capture, Greenland, and the tariffs against India,
it's not about national interest, it's about this small group of hyper-elites, this clique actor kind of cluster's interests. And so that really drives a very different logic of how international politics functions.
So while Venezuela's oil is too expensive to benefit the American oil industry as a whole, the specific American refineries that did benefit just so happen to be controlled by Trump mega donors such as John Addison from Vitol. Similarly, while Greenland's minerals are not worth enough for the US to alienate allies over, that price may well be worth it to billionaires with extensive interest in Greenland, like Ronald Lauder, who reportedly put the idea into Trump's head in 2018. Finally, there's Trump's mega tariffs against India. Again, from a great power perspective, it makes no sense to alienate China's biggest Asian rival. But if you consider that Modi very publicly humiliated Trump by stating that he had nothing to do with Pakistani-Indian peace in the summer, Indian tariffs immediately after that incident start making a lot more sense. But while neo-royalism can fill in a lot of gaps, in their article Goddard and Newman do recognize that the royalist dynamics have always been there in the background. After all, even during the height of great power politics, the 19th century, Belgian King Leopold, for example, used the Belgian state to conquer and dominate his own personal colony in the Congo. And even today, Trump-style personalist rule is quite common. However,
the difference between MBS or Orban and Trump is that they just don't have the material or status capability to transform the international system. And that's why Trump is so exceptional, because he has the US military and the US economy behind it.
In other words, just as Westphalian-style great power politics were always still there in the background during, for example, the Cold War, Goddard and Newman argue that royalist elements are and have always been a part of the international order as well. Therefore, my conclusion is that to truly make sense of where the global order is going, we need all three lenses. If Carney can make international organizations become more powerful again, the global order will again become more predictable. But if they become weaker, we will either see more great power games, where small and medium powers like Ukraine, Venezuela and perhaps even Canada become pawns or battlefields for great powers that continuously seek to become more and more powerful, because they fear that if they won't, they will not remain a great power for very long. However, if great powers are governed by autocratic or illiberal rulers, then we will increasingly see incidents like Trump's Board of Peace, which he plans to stay on even if he's no longer US president, where great power influence will not be used in the national interest, but rather to enrich personalist leaders and their cliques, or elevate their social standing amongst a new class of global rulers and their courts, that compete very much like the royal houses of Game of Thrones for power and status. So given that Trump will be in power for at least 3 more years, and given that far-right populist parties are still lurking in the shadows in many other middle powers as well, I think it's a safe bet that we will be seeing a more volatile international order emerging, which, whether it be for personal or national interest, tariffs, sanctions and even military strikes and wars will sadly become more common. The economic evidence so far tells us that this will make most of us poorer and less secure, especially given that unlike in the 19th century, great powers now have weapons that could kill us all at the click of a button. Still, it doesn't have to be that way. For example, some have argued that at the Congress of Vienna, after Napoleon was defeated, the return of royalism looked inevitable, yet this never happened. Similarly, who knows, perhaps Trump's successor will see the value of the liberal, rules-based international order again, and together with Canada and others, they may build yet another liberal international order from the ashes of the one that we just said goodbye to. So, what do you think? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to know more, I highly recommend you check out 3 follow-up analyses from our advertising sponsor, The Economist. Specifically, I recommend you check out this detailed analysis about while Trump may have backed down about Greenland, it's only the tip of the iceberg of Europe's geopolitical vulnerabilities. Indeed, why is it that in the New World Order everybody seems to be picking on Europe specifically? The Economist answers that question as well. Finally, check out The Economist's take on whether Mark Carney can actually help Canada find its place in this New World Order. I think as these analyses show, The Economist delivers insights that help you see the bigger picture. This is why I highly recommend you subscribe to The Economist, which now offers an exclusive 35% discount for Money and Macro viewers. Whether you prefer their daily journalism in The Economist app, or you're like me and prefer to catch up on the global economy during the weekend, sitting down with a nice cup of coffee and the paper edition, you'll always stay on top of the latest global developments no matter where you are. So Don't miss out. Click the link in the description or top comment below, or head over to economist.com/moneymacro to claim your exclusive 35% discount today.